Hi, I'm David Swanson. The Monroe Doctrine is turning 200 on December the 2nd, 2023. There's a Warner Brothers propaganda film from 1938 called The Monroe Doctrine and available on YouTube. And it opens with triumphant music and flags waving through the credits and then jumps straight into staged scenes of the evil British redcoats and heroic American revolutionaries, etc., shifting scene rapidly to match the words of a super pompous narrator who intones, "In 1775." Well, listen for yourself.
In 1775, our forefathers first learned the meaning of oppression, taxation without representation, the loss of civil and personal rights, so precious to a freedom-loving people, cruel punishments for the slightest infractions of the iron decrees of a royal dictator.
Now, I have watched this whole video, and this is not going to be a spoiler, but I will tell you, it is never made clear who the non freedom loving people are, the ones the freedom loving people are distinguished from. But the belief in their existence is fundamental to everything that follows.
But the vigorous young America, born to the plow and the gun, was quick to resent this despotism from across the seas, and soon the smoldering fires of rebellion flamed into open revolution.
Now, the little corner of the Americas being described here had been inhabited for millennia and inhabited by Europeans and Africans for centuries. But the anthropomorphized nation is imagined as vigorous and young. The British colonists had engaged in nonviolent resistance for decades and gained a great deal of independence. But they didn't make a decision to turn violent. Oh, no. They were simply born to the plow and the gun. Now, what the offspring of a plow and a gun would actually look like is not depicted in this film. Maybe a pesticide? It's critical also, of course, that the problem be despotism from across the seas, since we wouldn't want too much opposition to any despotism from right here.
For 8 long years, on land and on sea, Americans fought to loose the old world's stranglehold on their destiny. Finally, the war was won. The great Washington, chosen to lead the new nation out of chaos.
He had, by the way, also led them into chaos, and the victory was largely won by the French. But it's a good story. I wouldn't want to interrupt it.
The success of our democracy soon inspired the Latin Americas to renounce Spanish rule, and they quickly received our friendly recognition.
Okay, I want to interrupt it. Neither the word democracy nor the phrase Latin America was actually in use, and the US government aspired at most to be a republic, vaguely and partially accountable to wealthy white men. It also did not quickly give friendly recognition to those renouncing Spanish rule, and didn't give it at all until independence had already been achieved. In fact, US presidents and secretaries of state claimed that ignorant Catholic South Americans were not ready for self governance and needed to be dominated for their own good. The first successful revolution south of the United States was in Haiti, and the US government was opposed to, not to say horrified of it, because people of African descent had freed themselves from actual slavery and taken over. They are waiting to this day for the quick and friendly recognition. The South American wars for independence from Spain, led by Simon Bolivar, by 1823 had established independent nations in much of Latin America. While at the same time, Mexico got its independence in 1823 and Brazil in 1824, the US was in part an inspiration for this transformation, but had almost nothing directly to do with it and was rather confused about what to do about it. During James Monroe's presidency, statues of Simon Bolivar were put up around the United States. Towns were named for Bolivar across the rapidly growing US, and countless baby boys were named Simon. Bolivar favored US like independent and elected governments. He read the same Europeans that US revolutionaries read. He used violent revolution and denounced monarchy. He even agreed with various North Americans that South Americans were not ready for a republic. He chose independence and unity over democracy, but he intended Jeffersonian language without the hypocrisy. He freed both governments from foreign monarchs and people. He freed both governments from foreign monarchs and people, including indigenous people, from slavery, although not from mandatory military servitude. He denounced Spain for the horrors it had committed since the arrival of Columbus, not just for a few recent pieces of tax legislation. And he dreamed of creating a single large but southern nation and failed, creating instead a series of smaller nations in the areas that are now Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, and Panama, a total area several times larger than the original United States. And he was assisted by Haiti, by Ireland, by Great Britain, but not by the US government. While Speaker of the House Henry Clay and others insisted on support for Latin American revolutions, President Monroe did not, and the House voted against it. Monroe did not want to antagonize Spain while he was trying to negotiate Florida away from it. But it was over a year after he had fully acquired Florida and a claim of land all the way to the Pacific that Monroe finally recognized the new nations of Buenos Aires, now Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and Peru, as well as Mexico, and asked Congress to fund the creation of embassies. Presumably, the motivations for finally recognizing these newly independent nations included that they had succeeded, that there was no longer a question of joining in wars, and that the US had some sympathy and respect for the new countries. But those new countries were being recognized by and forming alliances with other nations, and the United States did not want to be left out.
But Spain, for 3 centuries mistress of the Americas, enlisted the aid of other European monarchies, planned to reclaim her vast territories in the Western world. In 1823, the cabinet of President James Monroe was debating a vital question. How should the United States meet this menace to New World freedom?
Now we have lies placed in a Secretary of State's mouth. Not an unusual place for them.
This is the first great test of American democracy, and the result may well decide the fate of our own national existence. We of the Americas must promptly discourage any form of European intervention. The United States was the first to recognize the new democracies of South America. Let us be the first to give them aid, and thus ensure our own government against any future attempt to change it.
Historians tell us that the US was not the first to recognize these nations, and that the fear that the Holy Alliance of European nations would try to take them over was not remotely justified and never happened, and that this would become a pattern for the Monroe Doctrine. The British and the French would not be threatening anything when President Polk would use what he called Monroe's Doctrine to steal half of Mexico, and Germany would have planned nothing when Theodore Roosevelt would announce his expansion of the Monroe Doctrine to counter the German menace. When Monroe made the speech that contained the doctrine, it was a speech packed with militarism and imperialism, and it introduced the idea of war into the questions of South America and Oregon. No government or even individual in either location had requested what Monroe was promising, and it is not even clear that Monroe recognized anyone in either location as having the ability to request or refuse it. Regardless of Monroe's speech, the United States did not bother to pursue good relations with the new American republics. The US government had few competent diplomats or even Spanish speakers and was geographically closer to England than to Argentina. The divide between monarchical Europe and democratic Americas was complicated by advances in freedom in Europe and by monarchy and slavery in the Americas. But the tradition developed of labeling threats to empire or even to life as threats to, quote, freedom, a nonsensical verbal tick still with us today.
Gentlemen, I should like to read you this letter from ex-President Thomas Jefferson. The question presented is the most momentous since that of independence. That made us a nation. This points the course which we are to steer through the ocean of time opening upon us. The Americas have a set of interests distinct from those of Europe and peculiarly their own. They should therefore have a system of their own, separate and apart from that of Europe.
I still see no sane reason why we should jeopardize our own peace by interference with the affairs of other nations.
He's right. Were what you call other nations may one day be as necessary to us as we are now to them.
Generosity, benevolence, philanthropy, and enlightened self-interest as foreign policy. But this is mythology. The Monroe Doctrine declared the power to keep Europeans out of areas in which the United States hoped to practice imperialism, North, Central, and South America. Countering European imperialism was a means of claiming that what the United States was doing couldn't itself possibly be imperialism. Other means were the belief that anyone would want to be part of the United States, so there could be no such thing as compelling them to be, as well as the belief that people would have that desire if they were smart enough, as well as, of course, the belief that lands were more or less empty of people, despite all the people living on them. Monroe's speech did not immediately change international behavior. The US and Britain went on competing and collaborating. While the Holy Alliance had decided not to invade South America prior to the Monroe Doctrine, President Monroe reversed the actual chronology of events to falsely claim that his speech had kept them out. One person who never fell for that was Simon Bolivar, who saw Britain and not the US as the only important military and commercial power, and saw Britain's as the model government to be emulated. 2 years after the Monroe Doctrine was spoken, President John Quincy Adams sought to maintain Spanish rule over Cuba. When Bolivar invited the United States to an international Congress in Panama, the debate in the US Congress over the question of attending featured extensive racism towards South Americans, who would soon be frequently called South Americans rather than residents of the one American continent. The debate also dragged on so long that when a delegation was finally approved and sent, it arrived too late to take part. In 1829, Bolivar wrote that the United States, quote, seemed destined to plague America to misery in the name of liberty. Any widespread view of the United States as a potential protector in Latin America was very short lived. According to a biographer of Bolivar, quote, there was a universal feeling in South America that the firstborn republic, which ought to have helped the younger ones, was on the contrary, only trying to encourage discord and to foment difficulties so as to intervene at the appropriate moment.
Perhaps Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Spain are no mean antagonists. It would be foolish to defy them.
I agree with Calhoun.
What does the president say? I haven't heard him commit himself.
Mr. Monroe is a cautious man, but he is a patriot. And when he has thought the matter out, I'm sure.
Monroe was a cautious man. Was he? Most presidential historians are myth makers. They'll tell you that Monroe was a very personable and likable character, very restrained and diplomatic. Maybe he was. Yet he nearly dueled with Alexander Hamilton. The dispute was probably resolved by the man assigned to be Monroe's second in the duel, Aaron Burr, who would later kill Hamilton himself, and whose view on Monroe was less than positive. Burr said of Monroe, quote, the man himself is one of the most improper and incompetent that could have been selected, naturally dull and stupid, extremely illiterate, indecisive to a degree that would be incredible to one who did not know him, pusillanimous and of course hypocritical, has no opinion on any subject, and will be always under the government of the worst men, pretends, as I am told, to some knowledge of military matters, but never commanded a platoon, nor was ever fit to command one. He served in the Revolutionary War. That is, he acted a short time as aide-de-camp to Lord Stirling, who was regularly drunk from morning to morning. Monroe's whole duty was to fill his lordship's tankard and hear with indications of admiration his lordship's long stories about himself. Such is Monroe's military experience. As a lawyer, Monroe was far below mediocrity. He never rose to the honor of trying a cause of the value of £100. Monroe was in fact, end quote. Monroe was in fact an imperialist. From age 17 to age 23, he was a soldier, and he thought like a soldier from then on. Those were years of revolution, 76 to 81, during which he showed courage in battle and became a war hero who carried a British musket ball in his chest. He also saw the British burn New York City in 1776, as he would later see them burn Washington in 1814. War was an accepted inevitability. War was what advanced James Monroe's career. His answer to the horrors of war, as it often is, was better preparations for more war. His feelings for the British were never better than mixed. Monroe was governor of Virginia during Gabriel's Rebellion of 1800, when the enslaved attempted to act on the rhetoric of Thomas Jefferson and violently free themselves. Monroe responded with martial law and executions, followed by giving a major boost to Virginia's military spending. Monroe believed that a military threat existed within the U.S. as long as people of African descent were present. In addition to boosting military spending, he tried to ship black people whom he didn't own to Africa. Monroe was a Virginian imperialist as well as a U.S. imperialist, a supporter and defender of Charlottesvillian and genocidist George Rogers Clark. As a war veteran, Monroe was given 5,533 acres of Kentucky by the U.S. government, which did not own it. He supported this practice of giving other people's lands to veterans. Monroe found in the need to, quote, remove Native Americans ever westward, as in the need to suppress slave rebellions, an opportunity to counter accusations of hypocrisy with violence and preparations for more violence. The story of U.S. conduct in New York State during Monroe's presidency, 1817 to 25, probably lacks no outrage ever later committed in Central America under the banner of the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe and many of his contemporaries lived with fears not only of resistance from the enslaved or the dispossessed, and not only of challenges from European militaries, but also of breakaway states on the model of Aaron Burr's escapade, or of breakaway states aligning with European powers, or of civil war over the divisive question of abolishing slavery. Monroe's answer to that last point was compromise to delay the crisis. He signed the Missouri Compromise into law, but Monroe's answer to every point was militarism. Monroe did not seek military preparedness under the misguided but popular today idea that doing so reduces rather than increases wars. Monroe sought wars. During the 1790s, unlike his Republican mentors and allies, he advocated for a new war with Britain. He wanted to invade Canada, occupy Bermuda, and take over access to the Mississippi. With only slowly growing support for this approach from Federalists or Republicans, Monroe would push this sort of warmongering for decades. In 1810, as a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, he played on his war hero status to successfully urge Virginia to demand that Congress invest more in militarism and seize West Florida. Monroe was Secretary of State for President Madison when they got the War of 1812 going. Monroe ran around proclaiming that war with Britain was regretfully inevitable, while hunting for some means of getting it started. He sought to create a spy agency. He proposed creating a military draft, successfully blocked by Congressman Daniel Webster and others who denounced it as unconstitutional. He eventually obtained for the Department of War 35% of all government spending. He helped spend the U.S. government into debt, reversed his and his party's position to support a national bank, and did much to create that beloved institution known as taxation. Monroe didn't just want military spending, and he didn't just want wars. He also wanted to be in the wars himself. He continually asked President Madison to give him a field command in the War of 1812 and eventually got himself made Secretary of War, where he demanded huge increases to the size of the military and its budget. Monroe won the presidency in 1816 with a total of 183 votes and began work on a permanent standing army and unsuccessful efforts to create a draft. He spent much of his presidential efforts on building bases and ships, sending ships as far away as the Pacific and the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean, Stephen Decatur commanded U.S. ships against Algiers in perhaps the first U.S. use of gunboat diplomacy. Monroe was a lifetime enslaver of human beings, who inherited some of them as property at age 16, who purchased Sally Hemings' sister, who eventually owned 75 people, bought and sold them and rented them out, never freed them. At the time that his life ended, he sold them to pay his debt. Monroe was so aware of the possibility of freeing people from slavery that he devoted a great deal of energy to doing something about those who were freed, namely trying to get them all shipped off to Africa, where the capital of Liberia would end up being named Monrovia in his honor. But I come not to praise President Monroe, but to bury his doctrine. And here he comes now.
Well, from the temperature in here, I take it you've been arguing again. Be seated, gentlemen.
We'd like to know what you mean to do, Mr. President.
I haven't quite decided. But I will have by next week when I read my annual message to Congress. Mr. Adams, I hope you explained that to the ministers from Spain and her allies.
I did, Mr. President, but they didn't seem to like the idea of waiting.
They'll have to wait. Whatever the United States does now must be the basis for her future policy concerning all the Americas.
So not only is President Monroe, manly man, admirably rude to Spain, but he has seen the future. He has discovered that decades later, selected bits of his speech will be excerpted and turned by pundits and politicians into something called a doctrine, something that did not exist until that first one was created. Many more have been established by the corporate newspaper branch of the US government with ever increasing frequency, so that now every new president will have one made out of whatever is the worst thing he or she says. Monroe, the imaginary one in the movie, somehow knew that his doctrine would be carved in stone and treated as the supreme law of the land. This is history as told by a pompous narrator.
Meanwhile, in Madrid, Ferdinand VII and the envoys of his despotic allies were making final preparations to stamp out democracy in the Latin Americas.
Colombia, Peru, Chile, and all these other so-called democracies
Which were not so called.
must be restored to our rightful rule. And they will be restored, gentlemen, if Spain can count on the help of your government.
Austria pledges herself to Spain, Your Majesty.
And Prussia also. The doctrine of government by the people must be confined to the borders of the United States.
Sire, I speak for Alexander I, Tsar of all the Russias. We too wish to help,
But what, sir?
Sire, Russia has made great investments in the Americas. She feels herself entitled to California and the Oregon Territory.
In the Americas, there is more than enough for all. Spain will not forget her obligations.
Nor Russia hers, Your Majesty.
The United States may object, of course.
She would hardly dare do more than that.
And if she did dare,
What can the United States do about South America?
gentlemen, I wish I knew the answer to that.
In fact, the United States did little to nothing to uphold the Monroe Doctrine to the South for years, as it focused on upholding it through expansion westward. It would later shift toward military invasions and later coups and later still corporate and financial domination, but rare are any actions in history in which the US government sought to protect Latin America from Europe. Of course, the scene we're watching never happened.
In Washington, Speaker of the House Henry Clay, fighting champion of American liberty,
Who owned human beings his entire life.
ringingly challenged the autocratic aims of the European monarchies.
It lies within our power to create a system by which all our sister nations of South America shall act with us.
Because that's not autocratic, see?
Our present institutions make us free. But how long shall we be free if we allow Europe to gain another foothold in the Western Hemisphere?
Maybe Clay was a visionary. Here's the domino theory well over a century before the war on Vietnam.
Let us break all old world fetters. Why should we bow to the whims of European politicians? Let us become real and true Americans, and with our sister nations of the South, build an American system that nothing shall ever destroy. The chair recognizes Mr. Daniel Webster of Massachusetts.
I heartily endorse the sentiments of Mr. Clay. We want nothing from Europe. Let us therefore solemnly vow to keep America for the Americas and the Americas for America.
America, the country, claims America's the continent.
At the Washington home of Rafael de la Torre, deposed governor of a South American province, the ministers of Spain and her allies were in secret council.
Nobody found out what these fictional people secretly said, but that can't stop Warner Brothers from showing us.
This man Clay who is most dangerous to our cause. If President Monroe listens to him,
then the United States will fight to keep us out of the Americas. And Austria, for one, will not agree to war.
My country will take every means to safeguard her American colonies. But beyond that, she will not go.
Then Spain will fight alone and benefit alone.
If she wins, my friend, the United States is fast becoming one of the strong military powers of the world.
What makes you so sure the United States would resort to war? People don't want it. And in a democracy, the people rule. So I've been told.
Didn't know this was a comedy, did you? Maybe it's a tragedy, actually. In this fictional tale, threatening war is how the world is improved. And it must be done in the name of democracy. But there's that nasty little problem of the people who don't want it. One can just smell the rules-based order slouching toward Pennsylvania Avenue to be born. But what this movie needs, I think, is a romantic love story.
Clay has many followers. It was he who first advocated recognition of the South American republics.
Yet he and Monroe have never agreed on South American policy. Why should they not?
You seem to know a great deal about Henry Clay, Senor.
I encouraged my daughter's friendship with his secretary. Mr. Sturgis is not my idea of a son-in-law, but he is a very convenient information bureau. Gentlemen, my daughter. And Mr. John Sturgis, secretary to Mr. Henry Clay.
Well, now we're talking romance and underhanded, shameless deception by nefarious enemies. The plot thickens, as does the poetic license.
Later, at the minister's ball, the question of the hour was still unanswered. What would the United States do?
Latore. Good evening, John.
Good evening, sir. Mrs. Clay. This is my Latin American problem, sir. Perhaps you can advise me how to solve it.
You might try firmness, my boy. Sometimes it works.
But only when we're willing it should. That's true.
Various meanings here, but sticking to the political ones, it seems that Latin America is a problem to be solved with firmness. Let's see how that works out.
Seriously, John, I'd suggest you watch the door. You may get an inkling of what the president will say tomorrow and find a solution to this very distracting problem of yours. Look.
The minister from Paraguay. The minister from Peru. The minister from Spain. The minister from Russia. The minister from Austria. The minister from Prussia.
I found my solution, sir. Come, Rosita. John? You'll excuse us?
Of course.
So Latin America may be a problem, but it will follow you if you tell it to come.
Are you trying to tell me that you're in love with my daughter?
Of course I'm in love with her, sir.
And you want to marry her, I suppose?
He doubts this innocent U.S. love for Latin America. Well, so do I.
You don't understand, senor. There's much more to it than that.
There is indeed. Your presumption is an insult. You think that I would even consider such an offer from a nothing, a nobody, the starving secretary of a cheap American politician?
Be quiet, sir.
How dare you?
My apologies, senor, but I cannot permit my wife's father to make a fool of himself.
What do you mean?
For the past 10 minutes, I've been trying to tell you that Rosita and I have just been married.
Foiled again. It's too late for the arrogant monarchist. The United States has sent a few snobs of its own who don't speak Spanish to set up embassies and proclaim itself the big brother of the baby republics. The marriage has been consummated. We now return you to the literal story with no more love scenes.
That same night, in his White House study, President Monroe took the fighting stand of Clay and the American people. With John Quincy Adams, he prepared an ultimatum to foreign aggressors that will live forever in the hearts of his countrymen.
I think we have it now, John.
Good. Let me hear it.
Live forever. Forever is a mighty long time. When the Monroe Doctrine turned 100 in 1923, it may have seemed carved in stone. It was celebrated with a $50 coin. Some 10 million school children listened to the doctrine being read and discussed just as if it were the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July. It was read on the radio. It was discussed in the newspapers. Mary Baker Eddy, founder of the Christian Science religion, said, quote, "I believe strictly in the Monroe Doctrine, in our Constitution, and in the laws of God," end quote. But 100 years later, in 2023, as the thing approaches a mere 200 years of age, The US government still abides by it, minus the part about staying out of Europe, of course. But roughly half of the US establishment pretends to shun it, and approximately the whole US population has either no idea or a pretty limited idea of what it was or is. Well, which exact words from Monroe's speech count as the doctrine may be somewhat open to debate, but here comes one version.
The occasion has been judged proper for asserting as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers.
Splendid, James, splendid. But neither must Europe be allowed to spread its political doctrines in the Americas. We don't need them and we don't want them.
I'm coming to that. In the wars of the European powers, in matters relating to themselves, we have never taken any part, nor does it comport with our policy to do so.
Oops. Some of these guys' countrymen's hearts are having a torrid affair with NATO before the clock has gotten anywhere close to forever. But that part of the doctrine can simply be chiseled out of the monuments.
It is only when our rights are invaded or seriously menaced that we resent injuries or make preparations for our defense.
Now, this is very curious. Everybody knows how you invade a country, but how do you invade a right? And how do you defend against the invasion of a right? I think pretty clearly the invasion of a right means the invasion of a place that you wanted to invade or control instead of letting someone else do it. And you call this defensive rather than offensive precisely by declaring it a right.
We'll defend those rights with our lives.
With the movements in this hemisphere, we are of necessity more immediately connected, and by causes which must be obvious to all enlightened and impartial observers.
And we'll mind our own business, so long as they don't try to do it for us.
We owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety.
Of course, an actual threat to U.S. peace and safety would be understood by everyone as a threat to U.S. peace and safety. This is a declaration that something that is not a threat to U.S. peace and safety will be considered to be so. In the speech that contains the Monroe Doctrine, we have a formalization of the idea that defense of the United States includes defense of things far from the United States, that the U.S. government declares an important interest in. This practice continues explicitly, normally, and respectably to this day. The 2022 National Defense Strategy of the United States, to take one example of thousands, refers consistently to defending U.S. interests and values, which are described as existing abroad and including allied nations, and as being distinct from the United States or the homeland. This was not brand new with the Monroe Doctrine. Had it been, President Monroe could not have stated in the same speech that, quote, the usual force has been maintained in the Mediterranean Sea, the Pacific Ocean, and along the Atlantic coast, and has afforded the necessary protection to our commerce in those seas, end quote. Monroe, who had bought the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon for President Thomas Jefferson, had later expanded U.S. claims westward to the Pacific, and in the first sentence of the Monroe Doctrine was opposing Russian colonization in a part of North America far removed from the western border of Missouri or Illinois. The practice of treating anything placed under the vague heading of interests as justifying war was strengthened by the Monroe Doctrine, and later by the doctrines and practices built on its foundation. We also have in the language surrounding the doctrine the definition as a threat to U.S. interests of the possibility that, quote, the Allied powers should extend their political system to any portion of either American continent. The Allied powers, the Holy Alliance or the Grand Alliance, was an alliance of monarchist governments in Prussia, Austria, and Russia, which stood for the divine right of kings and against democracy and secularism. Weapons shipments to Ukraine and sanctions against Russia in 2022, 2023 in the name of defending democracy from Russian autocracy are part of a long and mostly unbroken tradition stretching back to the Monroe Doctrine. That Ukraine may not be much of a democracy and that the US government arms, trains, and funds the militaries of the most oppressive governments on earth are consistent with past hypocrisies of both speech and action. The slaveholding United States of Monroe's day was even less of a democracy than is today's United States. The Native American governments that go unmentioned in Monroe's remarks, but which could look forward to being destroyed by Western expansion, some of which governments had been as much an inspiration for the creation of the US government as had anything in Europe, were often more democratic than the Latin American nations Monroe was claiming to defend, but which the US government would often do the opposite of defending. The Monroe Doctrine also advanced the idea, still very much alive today, that a US president, rather than the US Congress, can determine where and over what the United States will go to war, and not just a particular immediate war, but any number of future wars. The Monroe Doctrine is, in fact, an early example of the all purpose authorization for the use of military force, pre approving any number of wars, and of the phenomenon much beloved by US media outlets today of drawing a red line. As tensions grow between the US and any other country, it has been common for years for the US media to insist that the US president draw a red line, committing the US to war in violation not only of the treaties that ban war making and not only of the idea expressed so well in the same speech that contains the Monroe Doctrine that the people should decide the course of the government, but also of the constitutional bestowal of war powers on the Congress. Examples of demands for and insistence on following through on a red line in the US media include the ideas that President Barack Obama would launch a major war on Syria if Syria used chemical weapons. President Donald Trump would attack Iran if Iran proxies attacked US interests. President Biden would directly attack Russia if US troops in Russia attacked a NATO member.
This is one message to Congress that will never be forgotten. Down through the years, it will be known as the Monroe Doctrine.
This is, of course, fictional nonsense, not a prediction that was actually made.
Adams' prophecy was well made. On December 3rd, 1823, before the crowded halls of Congress, James Monroe uttered the words that were to secure the lasting liberty of all the Americans.
With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere. But with the governments who have declared their independence and maintained it, and whose independence we have, on great consideration and on just principles, acknowledged, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them or controlling in any manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States. In the war between those new governments and Spain, we declared our neutrality at the time of their recognition. And to this we have adhered and shall continue to adhere, provided no change shall occur, which in the judgment of the competent authorities of this government shall make a corresponding change on the part of the United States indispensable to their security. It is impossible that the Allied powers should extend their political system to any portion of either continent without endangering our peace and happiness. Nor can anyone believe that our Southern American brethren, if left to themselves, would adopt it of their own accord. It is equally impossible, therefore, that we should behold such interposition in any form with indifference.
Time and circumstance broadened the phrases of the doctrine, but its basic principles remain.
The conquest of much of North America was the most dramatic implementation of the Monroe Doctrine, and the Monroe Doctrine was used as a justification for it, just as for interventions to the South. In fact, the Monroe Doctrine was first discussed under that name as justification for the U.S. war on Mexico that moved the western U.S. border south, swallowing up the present day states of California, Nevada, Utah, most of New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado, and parts of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. By no means was that as far south as some would have liked to move the border. U.S. actions in Latin America have, through these 2 centuries, moved gradually through a number of overlapping periods in which first the U.S. military's interventions, and then U.S. supported coups, and finally U.S. financial and legal pressures reached their heights. There has been a fairly steady growth of U.S. economic investment and influence in Latin America from 1823 to the current day, or at least close to the current day. Following the age of revolutions, Spain maintained control only of Cuba and Puerto Rico. Spain tried to retake Mexico in 1829 and was defeated by Mexico with no help from the United States. In 1833, the British claimed the Falkland Islands, and the United States did nothing. President Andrew Jackson was focused on a genocide closer to home. For years, the French Navy, with help from the British Navy, blockaded Argentina, and the United States did nothing. In 1845, the British and French intervened in a dispute between Argentina and Uruguay, and the United States did nothing. These and other instances seemed to perfectly fit the prescription of the Monroe Doctrine, and U.S. inaction confirmed Latin American suspicions of the United States. When the U.S. government did decide to act on the Monroe Doctrine outside of North America, it was also outside of the Western Hemisphere. In 1842, Daniel Webster warned Britain and France away from Hawaii. When the U.S. decided to act closer to home and to speak for the first time of Monroe's Doctrine as the justification, it was not to protect a neighbor from a European military. It was to attack and exploit the independent nation of Mexico, steal half its territory, and leave it so weak that a European nation would soon take its turn attacking.
California, 1845. Powerful European nations seeking a foothold in the Western Hemisphere contend for the Golden Empire of the Pacific. President James K. Polk employs the Monroe Doctrine, makes it plain that the people of the American continents alone have the right to decide their own destiny.
This, remember, is the description of a war of conquest. And maybe some people more than others get to decide their own destiny, as the Monroe Doctrine became the justification for profit and power-seeking filibusterers taking over parts of the Caribbean and Central America for their own glory and to spread slavery. And the indigenous people of California were slaughtered, ethnically cleansed, segregated, made to eat from troughs like pigs, and generally treated as unworthy of mention even a century later. In 1848, Nicaragua actually asked the U.S. government for protection against the British, and the U.S. government did nothing. The topic of greatest interest to the U.S. in Latin America for many years was not the need to protect any struggling young republic from invading monarchies, but the possibility of building and owning and controlling a canal to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Interest in this long-standing goal surged when the gold rush to California took off in 1849. In 1850, the U.S. and Britain made an agreement with each other about the use of Nicaragua for a canal, without consulting Nicaragua.
Cuba, 1852. France and England propose a joint guarantee over the strife-torn island, evince their willingness to act with the United States. But President Millard Fillmore divines their real purpose, extends the meaning of the doctrine, and warns that any such interference in American affairs will create serious complications, if not war itself.
The U.S. government still wanted to take over Cuba and had begun regularly sending Marines into the Caribbean and Central America to protect corporate interests. A major test of the doctrine came in Mexico in 1861 when the U.S. was busy attacking itself in civil war, and the British, French, and Spanish ships showed up in Mexico demanding debt payments. They had invited the United States to join them, and it had declined but not opposed. U.S. Minister to Mexico Thomas Corwin proposed a U.S. loan to Mexico with which effectively to pay Europe to abide by the Monroe Doctrine, while locking Mexico into extensive trade with the U.S. and demanding mineral-rich lands as collateral. The U.S. Senate never ratified Corwin's treaty, but it pointed the way forward for the U.S. government in Latin America and elsewhere. The Mexican government and other Latin American governments were very open to accepting economic support, even with strings attached. Following the U.S. Civil War, the U.S. began sending aid to Republican forces in Mexico. In 1866, French armies began withdrawing. They had another war to fight in Europe. Ulysses S. Grant put U.S. troops on the Mexican border and urged President Andrew Johnson to order an invasion. In 1867, the French cleared out and the monarchy fell. The U.S. had played a very minor role, but would not remember it that way.
Mexico, 1866. Louis Napoleon has set up a French empire in the ancient land of the Aztecs against the free will of the Mexican people. Secretary of State William Seward cites the doctrine and in no uncertain terms warns the French to leave Mexico. To ensure their immediate departure, he orders an American army under General Sheridan to the Texas border.
Meanwhile, by the way, Paraguay had become, under a brutal dictatorship, the only Latin American country not dependent on foreign trade and investment, the only country with complete literacy, the only country without hunger, begging, or stealing. Paraguay had telegraphs, railroad, all kinds of factories, and Britain was not pleased. Britain's minister to Buenos Aires, Edward Thornton, worked to organize a joint operation genocide to be committed by Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay against Paraguay from 1865 to 70, paid for by the Bank of London, Baring Brothers, and Rothschild's Bank, with the loot ending up in British pockets. Only 1/6 of the Paraguayan population survived. The champions of the Monroe Doctrine had no objections. The imposition on Latin America of financial control and the maintenance of governments that have been, to one degree or another, puppets is an endless story, of which this is but one incident. But each incident has sent ripples down to the present day. The United States, of course, did nothing to protect Paraguay, and when later on Lyndon Johnson restated the Monroe-Kennedy Doctrine while attacking the Dominican Republic, some Paraguayan as well as Nicaraguan soldiers helped him under the direction of the Brazilian military. Paraguay also gave Brazil oil, although Brazil's oil business was in U.S. hands. Paraguay became indebted to New York banks and has never recovered. In the 1860s, the U.S. continued to reject invitations to join in meetings of Latin American nations, preferring to stay on better terms with European powers. U.S. discussions of the Monroe Doctrine continued to increase and to be made ever more racist, exceptionalist, and imperialist. U.S. imperialism to the South expanded right up to the date when we are traditionally told it first began, 1898. And an incident occurred in 1895 that impacted the use of the Monroe Doctrine. A long-standing border dispute between Venezuela and Britain, that is, Venezuela and British Guiana, was made into a major matter in Washington, D.C., when Venezuela learned a trick that many governments would practice in the decades to come. Unable to get a response out of the U.S. government, Venezuela resorted to hiring a former U.S. official to lobby for it. And he argued on behalf of Venezuela that Britain was in violation of the Monroe Doctrine and successfully urged both houses of Congress to unanimously pass and President Grover Cleveland to sign a resolution stating that Venezuela and the United Kingdom should settle the dispute by arbitration. The British were effectively made their own arbiters. The loser was Venezuela. But the British and the U.S. seemed to believe that it was Britain that had really lost in a rivalry with the up-and-coming U.S. empire.
Venezuela, 1895. A foreign power threatens to seize the country. President Grover Cleveland stands on the doctrine, is ready to maintain its principles. They will be invoked to secure the national safety of Venezuela or any other South American republic.
In 1898, by the way, even if this film doesn't bother to mention it, the Monroe Doctrine was used to help launch the Spanish American War. But so was a flood of almost modern propaganda, demonizing Spain, blaming Spain for a supposed attack that had killed U.S. sailors, to whom there are still monuments around the United States to this day. The United States went mad for war in response to an attack by Spain for which there was no evidence, merely conjecture. This alleged atrocity was used to launch a war in supposed defense of Cuba and the Philippines that involved attacking and occupying Cuba and the Philippines and Puerto Rico for good measure. In the Philippines, the death count, as well as the length of the war, 1899 to 1913, took on a shape familiar to 21st century eyes. The United States had 4,000 killed, mostly by disease, plus 64 from Oregon. The Philippines had 20,000 combatants killed, plus 200,000 to 1,500,000 civilians dead from violence and diseases, including cholera. By some estimates, the U.S. occupying forces, together with diseases, killed over 1.5 million civilians in the Philippines out of a population of 6 or 7 million, or 21% of the population. If that high estimate is right, then second to the genocidal attacks on Native American nations, this war was, by this measure, the worst war the United States has ever engaged in. In 1899, a global peace conference was held in The Hague, Netherlands. Since that date, except as updated by a newer treaty in 1907, all parties to the Convention for the Pacific Settlement of International Disputes have committed that they, quote, agree to use their best efforts to ensure the Pacific settlement of international differences. But the U.S. submitted a reservation to its compliance with the treaty, quote, nothing in the convention shall be interpreted as implying the abandonment by the United States of America of its traditional attitude in respect of purely American questions, end quote. In other words, the U.S. would join the world of international law and move beyond the age of settling disputes with mass killing, unless doing so conflicted with the Monroe Doctrine. With the opening of the 20th century, the United States fought fewer battles in North America, but more in South and Central America. The mythical idea that a larger military prevents wars rather than instigates them often looks back to Theodore Roosevelt, claiming that the U.S. would speak softly but carry a big stick. While it may be pleasant to imagine Roosevelt preventing wars by threatening with his stick, the reality is that he used the U.S. military for more than just show in Panama in 1901 and Colombia in 1902 and Honduras in 1903 and the Dominican Republic in 1903 and Syria in 1903 and Abyssinia in 1903 and Panama in 1903 and the Dominican Republic in 1904 and Morocco in 1904 and Panama in 1904 and Korea in 1904 and Cuba in 1906 and Honduras in 1907 and in the Philippines throughout his presidency. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine included these words, quote, chronic wrongdoing or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society may, in America as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation. And in the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power, end quote.
Santo Domingo, 1905. Two foreign nations plan to invade the island republic to enforce payments of debts. President Theodore Roosevelt enlarges upon the intent of the doctrine, warns he will not see it violated.
Now, we conclude this movie with a fictional mashup of the sorts of things Theodore Roosevelt liked to say. He liked to say that war was good for you and that he'd be happy with any war at all rather than peace.
Stand on the threshold of a new century. A century big with the fate of the great nations of the earth. America, young giant of the West, stands on a continent and clasps the crest of an ocean in either hand. We challenge the proud privilege of doing the work that Providence allots us. And we face the coming years.
The 20th century, by the way, and beyond now, was packed with horrors committed under this banner of the Monroe Doctrine. Wars and coups galore, permanent military bases, endless military training and weapon sales, financial and corporate controls, etc.
High of heart and resolute of faith, that to our people is given the right to win such honor and renown as has never yet been granted to the peoples of mankind.
How's that working out?
We will not permit any foreign power to take possession, even temporarily, of the custom houses of a South American republic to enforce the payment of its obligations. For such temporary occupation might lead into a permanent one.
And what gives you the right?
Peace is normally the handmaiden of righteousness. But as the world is now, only that nation is equipped for peace that knows how to fight. And such a nation will not shrink from fighting if ever conditions become such that war is demanded in the name of the highest morality. Speak softly, but carry a big stick. At present, there could be no greater calamity than that the free peoples, the enlightened, peace-loving peoples, disarm, while yet leaving it open for any despotism or barbarism to remain armed.
So, hooray for war and love peace by preparing for more wars.
Under no circumstances will the United States use the Monroe Doctrine as a cloak for territorial aggression. We desire peace with all the world, but most of all, with the other peoples of this American continent.
Wouldn't that be nice?